heat. So we start the disassembly by taking off the intake manifold first. Now there's a bunch of bolts that you want to take off in order to loosen it from the intake plenum on the other side. And there are a lot of hoses that connect to the manifold, so I called up my buddy to make the process a little bit faster. Also take off this one bracket that holds the manifold to the block. And just taking off any last hoses that are connected to the manifold, and the manifold is independent from the intake plenum. So next we take off the plastic cover, just a bunch of bolts there that you need to unscrew. Taking off the last bolt that disconnects the fuel rail, and what a beautiful piece of mechanism. Lastly, taking off this last bolt that holds the plenum to the head, and you can also see the valves in there. And here, I ain't gonna lie, I low-key got mad, so I took a hammer and hammered that bolt in as far as it could go into the filter, and used it as a way to turn the filter. But it's not the most efficient way of doing things. I just didn't have the right tool at the right time, and I just wanted to get the filter off. And you can also see the damage I did to the filter. So at the time being, I didn't have a breaker bar as well, so me and my buddy kind of improvised a solution to take off the bracket for the AC compressor. Just applied as much force as possible onto that ratchet to take off that bracket, and it worked. So taking off the AC compressor, there are just 3 bolts that connected to the block, and you just want to take those out. And lastly, just take off the sensor, and the AC compressor is now off. So I finally invested in a breaker bar. Let me just flex that real quick. And we're taking off the engine mount bolts next. Now from using a ratchet to a breaker bar, the difference is crazy. It's never been so much more easier. So next we take off the turbo inlet pipe, and I should have known there's oil in there, but I just didn't see it coming, and the oil dripped all over the floor, but we got it covered. So next we take off the turbo cover, and there's 2 bolts that were rusted, but they were easy to get off. So when I revealed the turbos, I didn't expect them to be that rusted, but it makes sense for a 30-year-old engine. So these nuts were easy to get from the top, but from the bottom they were super difficult. So my dad came up with a trick where he uses the wrench onto the nut and another wrench to hammer down. So he hammers that wrench onto the nut while I hold the wrench from the other side. And it works. You know, dad's got the best ideas. So taking off this water pump pipe, just 1 bolt there. And with a little bit of manipulation, it comes straight off. So taking off the alternator was next. There's 1 simple bolt that you can access that connects it on the water pump. And the other one is a nut that you have to take off, and thank God my fingers were not in the way, because I would have lost a finger that day. But then the alternator slides right off. So to take off the water pump pulley, there's just 4 nuts that you have to take off. And just hammer that thing with a hammer until it just pops out just like that. So to take off the upper timing cover, you need an Allen key, and you take off these 3 bolts. And on the last one, I had to use a wrench because it was just on there too tight. And taking that cover off, you can see the beautiful cam gears. So to take off the automatic serpentine belt tensioner, you want to take off these 3 bolts and just make sure you keep them safe. Do not lose them. Nice, just as I said that. But the tensioner comes right off. So after taking off the valve covers, you could see the beautiful camshafts in there. I believe they're 248s or 250s, I'm not quite sure. But they still look pretty beefy to me, and I was just quite impatient, so I just wanted to see the camshafts. So I didn't have a proper video of taking the crank pulley off, but essentially what you want to do is put a crowbar in the back with a bunch of bolts of the rear main seal and apply as much pounds of pressure onto that breaker bar as possible. I wasn't strong enough to do it, so I had my dad get it through, and we eventually got it off after 10 minutes of trying. Take off the automatic belt tensioner. You want to take off these 2 bolts. After that, also take off the crank angle sensor and make sure you keep this bolt safe. It's like your 10mm bolt, you cannot lose it. And just taking off that timing belt. Bro, they always manage to mess up my footage somehow. So to take off the exhaust cam gear, I had my broski help me out where he holds the wrench on the camshaft while I take the bolt off with a breaker bar. So before you take off the intake cam gear, you want to take off the variable cam solenoid first. And before you can access the actual bolt inside the cam gear, you have to take off this bolt cover. And then you can easily access the bolt and just take that off. So next you want to take off this cam shield, I think it's what it's called, and it's just 4 bolts holding it up. So you want to take off these bolts off the cam caps as well. So next you take off the bolts for the engine lift points. So to take off the cam caps, there's a certain sequence that you want to follow. I'll put a link in the description of what service manual I use so I can help you guys out. But you just want to follow what the FSM says, because if you start loosening the bolts in the wrong turns, you can actually break the camshaft or even the cam cap. So to prevent that, just look at the service manual and you should be good. But the reason why the camshaft breaks is that the springs are trying to push the camshaft towards the cam cap. And if you just loosen it in the wrong turns, it becomes unbalanced and it just breaks. So to take off the camshafts, don't use a hammer because that's the stupidest thing you'll ever do. All you want to do is hit the right side of the camshaft till it just pops open, and repeat the process on the other side. So next I take some isopropyl alcohol and just number them through 1 to 12 and which one's intake side and which one's exhaust side, so I don't mix them up when I take them out. So again, I didn't have the right tool, so I took a screwdriver and just kind of popped it up as best as I could to get that bucket out, but you can also see the beautiful springs underneath. So after taking off all the buckets, head studs were next. And there's also another sequence that you want to use to take those head studs off right there. I'll put a link in the description again just to help you guys out. And just take your breaker bar and just, do your thing with it. The bolts were really seized up, so I had to use I had to push to 1/4 of an angle, then my buddies pushed to 1/4 an angle. It was really tight, so getting those bolts off took a lot of energy. So after loosening the bolts, just take a drill and zap those suckers out and just put them to the side and just stack them up like you see right there. So after taking off the cylinder head, you can now see how beautiful the rotating assembly is and the firing order of the pistons. So finally, we can take off the MLS head gasket. Now these are one of the best head gaskets you can possibly have on an engine. The factory uses 3 sheets of steel metal and they just make that gasket as strong as possible for the mating surface between the head and the block. So next we take off the belt idler pulley and just use a breaker bar to take that bolt off. So I start taking the water pump bolts off. Now the water pump may or may not have coolant in it still, so just be mindful of that and take a bucket with you to drain the coolant out. So before I take the oil pan off, I make sure I drain the oil, and that's some nasty oil for a 30-year-old engine. So take a drill and just start zapping off all those bolts that hold the oil pan to the girdle. I hate having to use a pry bar on this. I've seen other videos, they say don't use a pry bar, but you can literally not get this off without a pry bar. So I just kind of pried it out, and the first reaction was the smell. It smelled like. So next, my buddy starts off by taking the bolts off the splash shield and also the oil strainer. Now the splash shield is good to sit in an oil pan because it separates the oil that spins in the crank and the oil that sits on the bottom of the oil pan. So after taking off the splash shield, you can see the beautiful crankshaft with the rods, the main caps, and just how beautiful that thing looks. But before we can actually get to that, we have to take off the oil level sensor and then also the oil girdle. So after removing all the bolts from the girdle, we took a pry bar and wedged it between the girdle and the block. But after cracking the girdle, we realized that there's still 2 bolts that are connected to the block. So it's gonna cost me $700 in the long run, but hey man, you around, you find out. So after taking off those 2 bolts, the girdle comes off flawlessly. Really wish I knew that before, but man, whatever. I put the crank bolt back onto the crankshaft so I can spin the crank and just see how beautiful that balanced assembly is. So next I started to take off the oil pump, just a bunch of bolts there and that one main bolt with the spring in it. Some bolt fell into the oil bucket, so it was a fun time trying to fish that out. But yeah, got that oil pump off. So finally we get to take out the pistons and rods. So I'm just loosening the rod bolts a little bit and then impacting them and then just pull the rod cap straight off. So to take the rod and piston out, you want to push down on these 2 pillars and essentially just keep pushing it till it comes out. But since I had a lot of oil residue build up, I had to take an extension, and my buddy hammered the extension down to the point where the piston just falls out. So after taking out the piston, you can see it has a lot of wear, oil residue, and carbon deposits. It's pretty normal because it does come out of a 30-year-old engine. So I use the same technique on all the pistons and they come out flawlessly. It's okay if I damage these pistons or rods because I don't plan on using the same ones. I plan on using any aftermarket components like Manley rods or Y-scope pistons, something like that, just to hold up the good power that I want to push. And this is how the crank spins with all the pistons and rods out. So to take off the main caps, you need a 12-point socket and you use a breaker bar because these are torqued pretty high. And just be mindful that they might be wedged into the block, so just use some type of technique to get those out. and that is main cap number 1. So the fourth main cap is hard to take off because there are thrust washers that are kind of wedged into the crankshaft. So I take all the other main caps off first and dealt with the number 4 main cap later. So a technique I cooked up is that you use the crankshaft and kind of tug on it upwards till the 4th main cap becomes loose and it just comes off straight like that. And you can also see the thrust washers that I was talking about earlier. So after removing the crankshaft from the block, you can finally see the main bearings and the oil squirters that are just resting on the block. So finally, we get to take off the main bearings and the oil squirters, and as you can see, the block is completely disassembled. So before I send the block to the machine shop, I went ahead and finally found the damn socket that I was looking for to take off the knock sensors, and just took off those 2 knock sensors, and the block can now be sent to the machine shop. So I guess I could finally say that I disassembled a 2JZ GTE motor. I appreciate you guys coming on this journey with me and watching the whole disassembly process. It'll mean a lot if you guys can leave a like, a comment, and a sub. I appreciate anything. But in the next video, I'm going to be installing all the aftermarket components like the pistons, the rods, the beefy camshaft, the turbos, all that good stuff. If you guys also want to check out my socials where I post about the engine almost every single day, feel free to do so. But I'll see y'all in the next video. Till then, take care.